All right, I remember to hit record. That's the first step in the process. So thank you everyone for showing up today. We have a guest speaker today. Dr. Jeffrey Lancaster is a senior higher education strategist at Dell Technologies, who is passionate about technology and how it can enable new human experiences. And I first heard Jeffrey speak at EDUCAUSE, paid for by Ideal. Thank you, Ideal. And I just found his talk fascinating. So I immediately got onto email and invited him to speak with us. And his talk today is going to revolve around three major points: understanding the responsibilities of students, faculty, administrators, and the community in supporting learners' digital literacies, confronting truth decay and identifying the skills necessary to combat it, and finally, articulating the characteristics of a new digital literacy that will drive progress in technology and society. So with that introduction, I will turn it over to Jeffrey.
Always that frightening thing when you write something and then somebody reads it back to you and you go, "Oh gosh, I did I write that?" I think I actually did write that, so that's at least representative of what I'm going to talk about today. So thanks for having me, Paul. It's great to be here with all of you to talk about digital literacy. Before I jump into the presentation, though, I want to tell you a little bit about me and my background because I think it'll be relevant to the topic and to the talk. So I am a higher education strategist at Dell Technologies. It's not a place I ever thought I would end up. I'm trained as a chemist. So I did my PhD in chemistry at Columbia. It's what got me up to the Northeast in the first place. I'm from Kentucky originally. After I finished my PhD, I actually became a librarian for a number of years at Columbia. So I was an emerging technologist for science and engineering disciplines. So I worked with faculty, students, and staff in science and engineering. Um, got a little bit frustrated with how slowly high ed moves. I remember Columbia was once described to me as a slow turning battleship. And I said, I don't want to be on the battleship. I want to be on a little pirate boat doing circles around the battleship. I wanted to try new things. I wanted to innovate. I remember the number of meetings that we had to have in order to buy a 3D printer. This was in 2011, far exceeded the actual cost of the 3D printer in terms of the salaries of the people who were getting paid to make that decision. So things like that just didn't sit well with me, I guess, at that point in my career. I ended up joining a startup where I taught people about technology. I taught Fortune 100 companies and leaders at those companies about technologies. I was teaching CEOs how to code. I was teaching CMOs about data science, CISOs about hacking, things like that. And so much of that was so that they could make better business decisions because they didn't understand the technologies. They understood their business, but they didn't always see how the two overlapped. And I think that gets us into digital literacy one way. I ended up joining Dell a little over a year ago, kind of right before the pandemic hit. And in that time, I have been out talking with leaders at the colleges and universities in the 16 states that I cover about everything from their pandemic response to continuity planning, to esports, to the classroom of the future, to smart campus, to new pedagogies, you name it. I'm kind of a generalist. I'm out there talking to people. I'm not a salesperson. I know people see Dell and you probably think laptops, but I get to engage the higher ed community. And so this is actually part of that. And this talk, we actually started putting it together probably about 8 to 10 months ago. Ended up delivering it at EDUCAUSE about 6 months ago. And we're going to see how well it's aged. Because the idea of digital literacy and digital inclusion has continued to really gain steam throughout the pandemic, especially in K-12, but also in higher education. So I'll touch a little bit on what Dell is doing toward the end of this, related to how we're thinking about access in a broader sense and what that means for underserved communities, what that means for closing the gap for digital inclusion. So with that and my strange background, we're going to jump in and talk about digital literacy. What I do want to say, though, is that I want this to be a conversation. I know that's increasingly hard on Zoom. I think you all probably feel that while you're teaching. So I'm going to ask you to use the chat a little bit. I'm going to ask you to use, if you want to, your voice. Feel free to interrupt me. Paul asked me to talk for about 40, 45 minutes, and then we can have a discussion and questions toward the end. I don't have much of an agenda. If we get through all of this, great. If we don't, that's okay too. So to get us started, I wanted to begin with a question. And that question is, what does digital literacy mean to you? So if you could take a second, think about that, pop something into the chat if you would like to. Feel free to come off of mute and share as well if you would like to. When you think about digital literacy, what does that mean to you? It means so many different things to so many different people, and it's a different baseline for everybody. So I just want to gauge with you all, where are we starting this conversation?
I guess I always think of digital literacy as learning appropriate digital tools, and then, as importantly, using them responsibly and appropriately.
Fantastic. So the responsible use of tools, fun online tools, thank you, Catherine, for that. Improving the quality of information on the web. All right, so actually taking it back to the content itself and the quality of that content. Anybody else want to share what they think of when they think about digital literacy? Being able to choose and use technology. That's great. Great definition. And participating in the digital world. Absolutely. Any other thoughts about digital literacy? Paul said he was going to mark down extra points for anybody who participated in the chat. So it's just what he said, you know. Identifying misinformation. I like that, John. We'll touch on that a little bit today too. So, you know, digital literacy has come to, you know, it's not a new term. It's been in the kind of zeitgeist for a little while, especially in the academic community. I think what we've seen, though, when students suddenly went remote, is that the meaning of digital literacy in some cases took on a much more foundational meaning. It meant, can I connect to my home Wi-Fi? Do I have home Wi-Fi? Do I know how to get my students connected to the LMS? Things that many of us probably take for granted. You know, that idea of being digitally literate meant there's a very basic level of literacy necessary. Not to say anything about more advanced sort of being able to determine kind of the truthiness of things. And so what I like to do with any of these cases is to kind of split the term apart. Literacy, you know, when we think about who is literate, we think about people who are educated, maybe at the base level, people who can read. I don't think there's much disagreement on that. But when we think about digital, digital has a couple of different meanings. So digital can mean, you know, hands of a clock related to your fingers. Obviously, when we're talking about digital, we're talking about the ones and zeros that function at the core basis of, you know, any of the technologies that we use, whether it's the device in front of you now, if you have a smartwatch, maybe it's your home thermostat, if you have a smart thermostat, if you're driving a car, you know, mechanics don't like cars nowadays because they're all run by computers. So it's really the ones and zeros inside of this. So putting those two things together, it's very clear that digital literacy means being able to read the ones and zeros, right? There's going to be some jokes in this because it's Friday afternoon and I have to keep you guys engaged. Well, of course not. Can anybody read what this says? Anybody? Anybody want to take a guess over in the chat?
Something funny, I hope.
Something funny, I hope. Change it to say something funny, I hope. Well, did you know that when you type an email, the letters that you're typing are actually represented by ones and zeros? And so we can actually look at a chart of all of the ones and zeros, the conversion between letters and binary. And if I wanted to say good morning, I could look up the G right here. And so I could say to you 0100, let me go back to that, 0100, 0111, and that would be the G. And I could go on and on and on and do that. Obviously, humans are not very good at this. It's not very good for communicating information. And if I inadvertently flip a 1 and a 0, I could drastically change the message that I'm trying to communicate. So in this case, this statement actually says hello world, which if we have any sort of programmers or coders out there, this is always the first thing that you try and get a computer program to say or to print or to show you so that you know that everything is actually working. So let's agree that digital literacy is not being able to read ones and zeros. Well, if it's not that, what is it? Well, problem is it's not just one thing. It actually is a compilation of a couple of different things. So the first one might be web literacy. This is what we oftentimes think of, being able to judge information, knowing whether the website that you're using was written by an authority or not. This is one of the things we try and teach students, who are trying to quote Wikipedia. Is that a reliable source, or is there maybe a different source that we want them to use? But the second digital literacy that I want to call out is cyber literacy. This is becoming more and more important. In any survey of chief information officers, cybersecurity is always at the top of the list. And so much of that is related to the fact that they are in charge of the security of an entire community, of their entire academic community. So having students have good cyber hygiene, and there's so many ways that students have terrible cyber hygiene, whether it's tagging, when they're on vacation and the metadata associated with an Instagram post, showing people that they're not home, right? There are tools that allow people to see that information. And too often students don't know that they're opening themselves up and making themselves vulnerable when they overshare online. Third type of digital literacy might be data literacy, understanding where your data is kept, where your data is stored, whether how your data is stored. I think institutions tend to do this very well, but that's kind of a blanket statement. So even thinking through social media and any breach, there was a LinkedIn breach that just happened. Facebook had a breach that just happened, another breach that just happened. So thinking through, what does that mean for the data that gets stored? How does that open them up to additional attacks potentially related to cyber literacy as well? And then the fourth one to call out here, sort of less well known, I would say, but might be hardware literacy. And so this might be any of the devices which have a digital component to them, all the way up to being able to run a Raspberry Pi computer, microcontroller, being able to use an Arduino to create different systems, around your home, or to be able to prototype and invent with those same tools, leading on to entrepreneurship activities as well. So, all of these literacies together, to me, roll into what digital literacy actually means. And there's some pretty heavy hitters who've come out and started to put some structure around each one of these. So for web and media literacy, for instance, I just want to show you, Mozilla has a great framework. The Mozilla Foundation is a super resource if you're not familiar with them. But thinking about how do different abilities and skills tie together into this overall sense of web literacy that students ought to have or ought to get in order to be prepared for the world of the future. There's cyber literacy. One that I didn't include on that last page was actually news literacy. This is becoming more and more important and has been tested tremendously. And so I think there are a number of organizations, including The Economist, who are putting out toolkits for how can we help students make sense of what it is they're reading on sometimes official looking websites, but that are not always fully truthful. So, why is this idea of digital literacy so important? Well, for me, I take a bit of a step back and I think about kind of where we are in time in the fourth industrial revolution. I'm thinking that's something you guys are all probably familiar with, the various industrial revolutions. For me, I like to look at what is the core underlying technology that drove that industrial revolution. So in the first industrial revolution, we might say it was water and steam power. Second industrial revolution was promoted by electricity. Third one, automation, right? So the ability to apply computation to data. But the fourth industrial revolution, I would argue, is really driven by autonomous systems. And we're seeing this throughout manufacturing. We're seeing this with the kind of fading of technology into the bleeding edge, where all of a sudden things can happen around us without us having to make a decision. Whether that's Amazon testing out a grocery store where you don't have a checkout, it just knows what you've picked up and it knows how to charge you, to self-driving cars, of course, but even to more mundane areas of our life, where we start to think about how can the university be automated? I didn't mean to call the university mundane, but just things that we take for granted, right? So how do we help with student success, apps and initiatives in a way that we can kind of set it and forget it? I grew up watching Ron Popeil far too many times on late night infomercials. And so this whole idea of autonomous systems is really driving us towards a world where there are certain decisions that we as humans are not making, but that machines are making, and we're often training those machines to make those decisions for us. So what I like to do is I like to look ahead. I like to imagine what the future is. These are some estimates that we've put together still. But by these estimates, by 2030, 125 billion devices and objects are going to be connected to the internet. This is going to be the Internet of Things that you may have heard a lot about. This is why 5G is so important. It's not because of Verizon and getting everybody to watch movies on their phones, but it's because of all of the devices that are going to be talking through these internet protocols, making decisions in the world around us. About half of cars are going to be driverless, can do a genome on a chip for about 94 seconds for about $1. Coincidentally, that's some of the research I did with my PhD was related to that. And then lastly, we have this idea of cognitive intelligence. You may have heard IBM's Watson on Jeopardy, being able to understand language, to be able to think about different meanings of words and to be able to provide a response. But this goes beyond that. This goes to tactile haptic interfaces. It goes to being able to smell and see and make out faces and do these things that we have historically thought of are human activities, but actually training computers to do those human activities as well as we do. I think we can safely say they don't do them as well as we do today, but time will tell. So, bringing it back to the student, we can think about what those jobs are in 2030 in that amazing, magical, technological world. Well, we're going to get a lot of new jobs that don't exist today. Things like a human technology integration specialist, self-driving car mechanic. There are going to be people who are focused on the ethics of data collection, right? We've seen some of that, and I think we've seen some of the fallout of that from certain companies as well. And so about 85% of the jobs in 2030 might not have even been invented yet. And along those same lines, we can think about what are the skills that students are going to need in order to succeed in those jobs. Things like in-the-moment learning, automation literacy, understanding how automation actually works. How does training a machine to do something actually work? And how can you change its behavior depending on how you train something? Being entrepreneurial, personal brand cultivation, we see a lot of that with TikTok. So, by a lot of these estimates, then, it's not actually what students are learning. In fact, I believe this, it's our collective ability to gain new knowledge and to continue learning that is going to be a marker of success, because technology is changing too fast for us to keep up with it. Anybody who's a coder, anybody who's a developer will tell you they have to be self-taught, because if they're waiting for a course to come out to teach them that next fancy language, it's too late, right? Things move so quickly now that to keep up, you have to be able to teach yourself these things. So with this idea of learning in mind, the challenges and the crux of this becomes, if I'm teaching myself, how do I decide what's real knowledge and what's fake knowledge? And this gets to this idea of truth decay. So truth decay, it's hard to explain this sometimes unless people have been living under a rock, but it gets harder and harder to tell what is real and what is not. And as the technology has advanced so rapidly, it's possible to create fake things that aren't true, but that very much look true. And so what we're going to do is, again, because it's Friday afternoon, we're going to play a little bit of a game. Can you spot the machine-generated content? Okay, so this is essentially, who made this thing? Was it a human or was it a machine? Everybody kind of understand the game? Pretty simple game. Try to keep it easy for everybody. So first one, we're going to start with some textual data here. So this is about home prices in Phoenix, Arizona. So bad news, homeowners, in the last month, home prices in Phoenix metro area have fallen. Overall, 3,214 houses were sold in Phoenix over the last 30 days. Phoenix County leading the way with 3,032 sales, and on and on and on.
But I need to hear them.
Do you think a human wrote this, or do you think a machine wrote this? Go ahead and pop in the chat what you think. Sorry, Phoenix metro area. There is no Phoenix County. Interesting. So therefore, okay, good. A machine wrote it. All right, good. This one was easy, right? We had to start easy, and we're going to build up to some harder ones. What made you tap into the fact that a machine wrote this? What was it about this, other than the fact that apparently Phoenix County is not real, that might lead you to believe, hang on a second, a human probably didn't write this? Last line sounds weird. Go find a bargain, buyers. It's very static, the grammar, okay? Lots of stats. Yeah, absolutely. So there are a number of companies. Go ahead. Somebody want to jump in? No? Okay. So there are a number of companies. One is called Narrative Science. Another one is called Quill, which I don't know why my computer keeps popping back. It must really like to be there. So this one is called Narrative Science. They are Automated Insights. They have a product called Wordsmith. And what they've done is they've automated a lot of reporting. So whether that's for the stock market and companies and thinking about earnings reports, or whether that's for like Major League Baseball, being able to take a stat sheet and quickly turn that into prose is something that they realized a machine could do nearly just as well as a human could. They could actually save a lot of money on having sports reporters out at all of the games in order to write the byline for the paper the next morning. So instead, they're feeding in data, and based on that, using that to generate that text, which then people consume in the newspaper and online and things like that. So, okay, that one was easy. I did mean to tell you, the reason that I was showing the Mona Lisa before, this is a little video from LinkedIn that I wanted to show you that somebody made, just so that you can see what's possible. All right, so the ability now is there to take a flat 2D image and convert that into a video and actually interact with it. So that's the world we're living in. All right, let's try one that's a little bit harder. 2 images. Which of these 2 people is real and which is fake? Is the one on the right real? Or is the one on the, well, let's say which one is fake. Let's do it that way. Is the one on the right fake or the one on the left fake? Okay. Eyes are too even on the left. Interesting. Wow, people are hating on the left image. Okay. John has no idea. I like that. I appreciate that. Thank you. Okay, Jed thinks the right has mismatched earrings. Okay, maybe on the left one. All right, well, you might be surprised to learn that both of these images are fake. Neither one is real. And in fact, there are a number of giveaways that some of which you guys actually called out. So one is the mismatched earrings. Great vision there, Leslie, to see, normally people don't wear 2 different earrings. The one on the right, you can kind of see this area over here on her glasses. They start to kind of fade. Is that 1 glasses, 2 glasses? I never said this was going to be fair, Jed. And then, the real dead giveaway is actually if you take and you overlap the 2 images, you're going to see something that the eyes are in exactly the same spot. And so this is actually a technique based on how these images are produced using what are called generative adversarial networks, or GANs. It's a type of neural network that can be trained on images of people in order to produce images of new people that don't exist. But they always start with the eyes, and they build the rest of the face out from the position of the eyes. And so another neat website that I want to show you about is called This Person Does Not Exist. And this is a website where you can go and just refresh your screen, refresh the page, and it'll produce an image of a person that is not real. All of these people are fake. let's try that one more time. All of these people are fake. And so you can use this anytime you need, fake headshots or anything to put into a presentation. They look pretty good though, and it tells you down there at the bottom how the GAN actually did the generation of the picture. All right, so we've seen text, we've seen some pictures. Next one, we're going to be a little bit more complex, the deep nostalgia photos. I did see the deep nostalgia photos. So the deep nostalgia photos were something, I think it was from genealogy.com or ancestry.com, something like that, where you could feed in an old photo and it would actually show them smiling, show them turning their head a little bit, doing some things so that you could get a sense of what that person might have looked like in 3D. Really interesting technology. I'm happy to see it not being used for nefarious ends. Too often we see these things being used kind of by bad guys. So next one, I just want to mention this. This is Thomas Middleditch. You may have seen him in TV shows like Silicon Valley. Well, he also starred in a movie that you maybe didn't see, which was called Sunspring. And Sunspring was a movie that was written by an AI. I'll share out a link to it afterwards, just I want to be mindful of time. But in Sunspring, what the author did was they essentially fed in the scripts of about 80 different sci-fi movies, and then had an AI write a new sci-fi movie. They then took that and produced the film. And so you can watch the whole thing on YouTube. It is between nonsensical and incredibly emotional. So I encourage you to go and check that out. Just when you want to think about, what is the world potentially going to look like? We might not need screenwriters anymore. We just feed in all of the old Harry Potter movies and we can figure out what the next Harry Potter movie is going to be about. So last but not least, let me see. Do people know what movie this is from? This still? Hopefully that's a yes.
Back to the Future.
Fantastic. So this is Back to the Future, the original. And I want to show you a screenshot or a bit of a scene from Back to the Future. See if you notice anything off about this. Anybody notice anything strange about what they're seeing?
That's not Doc.
That's not Doc. Who is that?
That's
Robert Downey Jr.
Iron Man.
That's Iron Man. That's Robert Downey Jr. And did you see who was playing the role of Marty?
Yeah, it was
Tom Holland.
That's Tom Holland. So somebody actually digitally switched the faces of Tom Holland, Spider-Man, and Robert Downey Jr., Iron Man, onto the faces of Michael J. Fox and Christopher Lloyd. So again, what does this mean for being able to make movies with people who are long deceased, or to have actors who are acting in roles who maybe didn't consent to being in those roles? So this is that brave new world where now the ability to tell whether something is real or not, and even what real means, starts to come into question. So lots more examples out there. I love this stuff, so I'd be happy to talk about this all day long if people want to. So whose responsibility then is it to make sure that students are digitally literate? I'm going to ask that in a rhetorical way. A lot of people say, well, it's very clearly the chief information officer's responsibility. And the CIO would say, no, that's not really my responsibility. I'm more behind the scenes. I make sure that the data at the university and that the systems are actually running the way they're supposed to. So somebody might say, okay, well then the chief information security officer. And they say, no, I don't really deal with students like that. I'm more kind of behind the scenes, making sure that the data is kept secure at the university. So some people would say professors and teachers and instructors. And you could say maybe they are, but a lot of the professors that I know say, can't possibly take on another topic. I'm already teaching my class and the content that I have for my class. I can't add on this digital literacy thing on top of it. So some people then say, well, okay, if not the teachers, maybe parents. And parents say, well, I don't know enough about digital literacy to be the expert on this. How can I be responsible for this? And again, you'll notice a little bit of my background here. Inevitably, it has historically fallen to the librarians to take up this mantle and to help educate students about digital literacy. But even they say, we can't possibly be the ones who are responsible for all of this. So who is, right? Who is actually responsible? I would argue it's actually everybody. All of these people need to take some stake and ownership in students' education around digital literacy. And in fact, it's not just these people, but it's also the students themselves. By the way, all of these faces came from this person does not exist. So none of these are real people. I would be shocked if you actually recognize somebody, but these are all fake people. So let's agree then that everybody needs to have a part in this idea of education around digital literacy, even the students themselves. And so how do you enable this digital literacy? And so I want to give you a couple of points around what I think it means in this day and age to be able to educate around digital literacy. So before we do that, quick reminder, digital literacy is all of these things: web and media literacy, cyber literacy, data, hardware. All of these things fit together into this picture of what it is to be in this world where technology is advancing very quickly. People are participating and interacting with these technologies. Sometimes it feels like the technologies just get out of hand a little bit too. So the first characteristic of the way that I think you enable digital literacy is that you actually embed digital literacies throughout an entire curriculum. I think a lot of schools, especially K-12, some higher eds do this. They might have a day, they might have a module that somebody needs to take, just for compliance sake. This happens a lot with faculty, right? Have I done my information security module? Yes, okay, great. I can move on and think about all the other things that I need to think about. Well, what if instead of doing it as a one-off, there was an undercurrent, a thread of digital literacies throughout all of the content that we teach? So whether it's in literature and thinking about how to validate sources, whether it's about thinking about how you could take that data and make something else from it, and what the responsibilities are around fair use, whether it's in communications and thinking about how the metadata associated with different communications might be used to benefit people, might be used to harm people. So thinking about different ways, thinking creatively about different ways to embed digital literacies in a curriculum means that it's something that students are always being confronted with, always being forced to think about, instead of being able to kind of park it off to the side and not have to consider it. Second thing I think is moving from a reactive posture about digital literacy to a proactive posture. Too often we say what you shouldn't do. I think the culture of no doesn't work when we think about behavior change and culture change. And so instead thinking about how do you proactively engage questions around truth decay, around being able to talk about what's real, about being able to judge sources. All of this, I think certain disciplines do really well, and I think it's sort of baked in already, but many disciplines don't do that. This could be anything from, putting my chemist hat back on, thinking about a lot of the discussion around the vaccine right now and how the vaccines came about, and hydroxychloroquine, and all of these things which are very much in the news, and you can imagine being a part of a discussion in any type of class. I think there's a way to make these touch points and to do that proactively. Third component, I just sort of mentioned, we are all responsible for this digital literacy. And I think that means engaging from through all levels of the institution, but also students and their parents and their support systems as well, so that everybody can take a stake in that preparation for that future world where this digital literacy is going to be so critical to success. Last component, and I think we've seen this more and more, is that equity and representation matters. Not just in terms of things like algorithmic bias, of course, but being able to identify the problems that technology should be solving. If only a subset of our demographic population are creating these solutions and are creating these technologies, they tend to create them for themselves. And so being able to have equity and representation on the teams who are creating these solutions, on the teams who are thinking about ways of using language, ways of embedding in communities, all of that can only benefit the subsequent outcome. And just to show you a couple examples of that, one that I really think is interesting, this was a machine learning algorithm was produced in order to depixelize images. You've seen this on CSI and stuff like that, where they're like, enhance, enhance, enhance. And it's totally bonkers, right? Can't actually do that. Well, what if you could do that? And so somebody fed in the image on the left and they got out the image on the right. Now, you as a human, thinking back to your cognitive abilities, you know who the image on the left actually is, right? It's Barack Obama, very pixelated. But the image on the right, not Barack Obama. It's in fact a white man, right? And a lot of that has to do with the fact that this image depixelization algorithm was trained on a data set that had a disproportionate number of white people in it. And so it doesn't handle people of color as well as it should. Another example, this came out a couple of years ago, had to do with algorithmic bias in the algorithms that are determining the risk of recidivism for parolees. And what it consistently found was that it ranked Black people who are up for parole as much greater risks of recommitting an offense than it did for white people who had committed the exact same set of crimes. The problem was that this was sort of a black box algorithm, something that this third-party company wouldn't allow anybody to audit. I think that's one of the real challenges of things like machine learning and deep learning, is that you can't go in and see how it works. You can't see the cogs and the wheels and the ways that it's making the decision that it's making. And so there's been a movement actually to move away from some of these machine learning algorithms towards something that is more human understandable. And by doing that, we can audit it and make sure that we're not embedding our own human biases into things that are actually having a real effect on people's lives. So those four characteristics, just to sort of summarize: a pervasive approach where it's everywhere, an activist approach where it's very proactive, a collective approach where we're all responsible, and then an inclusive approach where we are including, representing all of the voices that are necessary to make these things sticky. So this is what I've sort of coined for myself, this new digital literacy, right? We're moving past the idea of just thinking about how do we connect devices and make sure that people have access, to what is that next step? What's that level of education that's going to prepare students to be contributing members of that 2030 world workforce, whether it's in these new jobs, whether it's as entrepreneurs, whatever way that might be. How do we help them continue to learn so that as the world moves more and more quickly, they can keep up with it? Now, the last thing that I want to say is that this aligns with Dell's overall vision. You might say, why does Dell care about this? Well, Dell's vision and sort of mission, its driving sort of modus operandi, is to create technologies that drive human progress. And so one of the things that we're doing right now is we're working with ISTE and a number of other stakeholders to figure out how do we help people progress on their digital literacy journey? How do we take into account people who don't have access to the internet in order to help them get acclimated to being more digitally literate? And in this case, really the delta is what matters. We're not necessarily trying to make everybody into a technologist, but we're saying there are people who, their children can't get online to do their education because they don't know how to hook up their router, or they don't know how to use the access point that they might have gotten as part of a program. And so giving technology without that additional context as a wrapper around it is no good to anybody, and it doesn't do anybody any benefit, because if I've got that laptop and I can't use it, then it's just a paperweight. And so we're thinking a lot about, and we continue to think a lot about, how do we use these ideas around digital literacy and digital inclusion to make sure that we close that access gap and that equity gap, so that we can get to a point where we have equitable access to technologies, where we can indeed have an inclusive culture to have the effect of driving human progress. So that's sort of why Dell cares about that. And with that, I'm going to wrap up. I think I'm 4:40 on the dot. Paul said he would give me the showtime at the Apollo hook if I went too far past that. This is my email address. Would love to carry on this conversation after today. If this is of interest to you, I will also send a list of many of the links that I included, that I showed, and some that I didn't show. I'll send that to Paul to be able to distribute out to you. But as I said sort of at the top, before we just jump into the discussion and conversation, I am a resource available to you. Dell doesn't charge for my time. I'm a free resource that you get as a Dell customer. So if you ever want a thought partner on anything around this, if you ever want to take this and extend it, if you want to have a conversation about something totally different, please know that I am here as a resource for all of you. And those are conversations that I love having. So with that, let me stop sharing and see all of your faces again and open up the floor for questions and discussion. All right, so we've already got one question in the chat. Thank you. What digital skills are most prized by corporate industry? That's a great question. So it depends. I think one, I try not to take corporate industry as a like monolithic concept, just because different companies have different cultures, especially around technologies. I think I do believe that the ability to learn is key amongst everything, right? You're not going to be able to prepare students and say, here's the exact technical configuration of the company that you're going to go and work for. They're going to show up on day one and there's going to be some system or something that they're going to have to use that they were not ever exposed to in college. That's going to happen. So first I would say the ability to learn. The second thing, I think that I didn't really touch on in this, but that I think a lot about has to do with algorithmic thinking and thinking, how do you think through problems? How do you do problem solving? And algorithmic thinking is one way to do that, thinking about kind of using a computer as inspiration for how you can go about solving a problem. But I think even more than that, whether you consider this a digital skill or not is up to interpretation. But I think being user-centered is increasingly important to all of industry, right? Industry has sort of, I think, arrived at a moment in time where they're considering their customer and their consumer and who they are as a human. And you'll go to some companies and you'll see personas on the walls, and they'll be doing design thinking, and they'll be actually taking a different approach than what you might think of. And so whether you consider that a digital skill or just sort of a general skill that I think everybody ought to have, that's certainly something which I think students ought to be exposed to. Other digital skills, I don't think everybody needs to code. I do code, I enjoy that. I enjoy being able to prototype and get an idea out of my head and show it to people and actually have them be able to use it. I don't think everybody necessarily needs to. And so many of those skills, I think it depends on what field you're going to go into. Now, what I will challenge you with is to say, you might say marketing and communications, right? Well, a lot of ads online are being driven by algorithmic placement now. And so, that idea of understanding the technology behind things, I would argue that that's really important, and that's not going to go away. And I think you'd be hard pressed to find an industry that isn't being influenced, if not disrupted, by technology. And so I think students do need to understand how those digital influences are factoring into what's happening in their industries. I don't know, what do you think? Did I miss anything on that?
Well, if I may.
Please, yeah.
So I think it's interesting that you mentioned coding. I mean, there are simple ways for amateurs to instruct or learn coding. So I'm just curious, like, let's say you have an 8th grader, right? And you're saying the ability to learn. So what might you do? Like, you're advising some middle school, right? The teachers. How is it you might prepare them to teach the kid to learn coding? Because I agree with you. Like, coding is something that forces you to keep learning and learning over time. It's always changing, like you said. So yeah, can you give me an example of like some kind of exercise or tool you might use?
Yeah, we actually have a program started up in Canada, came down to the US recently. It's called Girls Who Game. It's focused on girls grades 4 through 8. That tends to be when girls are told STEM isn't for them. And what it does is it uses Minecraft in order to solve problems. So again, this is thinking about who the people are at the end of this. This is a partnership that we have with Microsoft. And so recently, the challenge and the problems that were associated with it had to do with like UN sustainable development goals. And so what ends up happening is that through both that problem-based approach and also a layer of mentoring and some other pieces to this program, the girls that are taking part in it are learning about how to use technology to solve real problems. So that would be one thing that I would sort of hold up as a way of thinking through. Okay, let me say it this way. I'm somebody that I can't sit down and just learn a technology. I need a reason to learn the technology. And I don't think I'm alone in that, right? So I always think about, what can I make with this? What can I do? What can I build to teach myself this thing? The last thing I learned probably was MongoDB, which is a database. I used it to build an app that's now part of a startup that I have with a guy that I know, right? That's about the future of work. Well, behind the scenes, it's all Mongo because that's what I had learned. And I was like, great, this will let me do some things. It's not to say you have to know how to code. There are a number of no code or low code tools that are coming out right now. Those are very hot in the kind of VC community and things like that. So if you want to look into those, that's an option as well, where you're kind of dragging and dropping modules together. I still think it's important to understand what's happening within each of those modules, so you can understand what sort of input do I need to give something, what sort of output should I expect to get. And I think that's another way to think about it. We're seeing a lot of schools build coding in as young as like first and second grade, right? Using, oh gosh, it's a tool, it's from MIT. I want to say Twitch, but that's not it. It's like Stitch or something like that. Not on the top of my head right now.
Yeah, that's what it is. Yeah.
But
Scratch.
what is it?
Scratch.
Scratch. Thank you. I was like, it's some kind of it's got an itch to it. So, so from Scratch up through, so thank you, Code Academy, some of the Apple Swift playgrounds. So much of this is about that push toward algorithmic thinking. And that once you know one language, it's much easier to learn any of the other ones, because then you're just sort of translating what you know into different syntax and maybe a different vocabulary. Okay, Tom asks, how would you measure a student's digital literacy? So great question. This is actually part of the work that we're doing right now with ISTE in order to, what we're trying to do is we're trying to essentially put people into buckets. And I don't want to say that in a bad way, but we're kind of trying to say, are you a novice? Are you a little bit more than a novice? Are you pretty adept, but you might, still have a ways to go? Or, are you pretty expert and you want to go from there? And so we're actually developing an assessment with them that we will then put out into the world that anybody can use. The assessment is then going to drive to a series of resources that people can use to self-pace their improvement in digital literacy. And so I don't have a great answer for that right now, but I hope to have a better answer in about a month and a half once we're ready to go live with that. Another question from Leslie, do I think digital literacy is different for students who are born digital? I've been reading a fair bit about this lately. I think born digital is a myth. I think it's a little bit unfair to assume that people grew up using an iPad for entertainment, that they necessarily know how that iPad works, or that they know all of the things that that they could do with that iPad. And so I actually want us to kind of move away from this idea of born digital. Do I think it's funny that, kids nowadays don't understand that the save icon is actually like a 3.5-inch floppy disk? Yeah, I think that's hilarious. And that they'll never understand like why the gear is used for preferences and things like that. Like, I think all of that is a little bit of kind of history of science that I'm really interested in, and history of technology. But I don't think we should presume that they know things just because of when they were born. I think they do still need a foundation in being able to judge and adjudicate and have the toolkit to be able to go in and say, okay, is this something that's trustworthy? Is this something that I should download? Is this something that I should give my information to? I think until they know to even ask those questions, being born digital, I think you're still in the cave at that point. Okay, Christopher, like that. It's like growing up with a fridge or television doesn't mean you understand refrigeration and broadcast technology. Yeah. I mean, like, we forget that people used to carry ice on trucks, right? And so, yeah, I think I studied for a year before I did my PhD, history of science, medicine, and technology. And so I like thinking about the pace of technology and what that means for culture, and what that means for education as well.
There was
Okay.
also a question in the chat about talking a little bit more about design thinking.
Absolutely. So design thinking as an approach. Well, let me sort of gauge the audience. Are people familiar with what design thinking is, first of all? No? Okay. So design thinking is a way of approaching problems which forces people to move away from the natural inclination to solution for problems. So a lot of design thinking is about first identifying and validating whether the thing that you think is a problem is actually the problem, instead of just jumping to a solution. So a lot of times people will just say, oh, I have a problem and I need the solution, when in fact the problem is not the problem that they thought it was. So it's a set of tools that you can use to get to know the people who are maybe confronted with that problem. It's a set of tools to assess, is that problem actually a problem? It's a set of tools to ideate around how do you think through what different possibilities might be, and to prototype and to build out solutions so that you're not wasting time and money. So, if you want to, I encourage you to look up IDEO. They have a great toolkit around design thinking. The Stanford D School sometimes is considered to be the creator of design thinking. I would argue it probably existed before they gave labels to things. But the idea is essentially, here's a framework that is very low cost, that you can iterate through very quickly so that you don't make the wrong move, right? So if we think about this in a business context, if I invest $30 million in a solution and it's the wrong solution, just wasted $30 million. This actually happened, an insurance company that's based in New Hampshire that I used to do some work with, they spent $10 million and they made an app and they posted it to the marketplace. And I remember they said, the guy who was telling me about this, he goes, we waited patiently for like the first month to see how many downloads we got. And when we went to look after the first month of spending $10 million to build this app, they had like 8 downloads, right? Because they had built what they could build. They didn't build what they should build. And so much of design thinking is about doing the thing that you should do, not just what you can do. And so in industry, that takes the shape of doing rapid iterations and cycles of this approach to design thinking, which is very nonlinear. It's very not waterfall, which is another term you might have heard about. With a bridge, you want to know what the size of the bridge is going to be before you get started, right? You don't want to change the size of the bridge halfway through. Never ends well. But with a product or with a tool or with an idea, you want to be able to change it. You want to keep it malleable throughout the process. And so it allows you to change and iterate and pivot. These are probably terms that you've heard if you watch kind of Silicon Valley and stuff like that, so that you end up with the right thing at the end of all of that effort. Yeah, paper prototyping for web design. Thanks for that, Christopher. Fast, low cost, low risk. Exactly. And so what I hope you're kind of seeing is that, in digital literacy, there are a lot of disparate ideas which are connected. We've connected up the idea of truth decay, design thinking, education and sort of responsibility for that education, new technologies, future of work. Each of these kind of has their own area and own kind of walled garden, but there are really these tunnels in between each of them that connect them, because the ideas of one very much influence each of the others as well.
A really quick question for you, Jeffrey. We don't have much time left, but I don't know if this is really accurate, but I always think of we're going from knowledge to learning, and
Mhm.
obviously those two are linked and connected. But what's going to happen to knowledge? For example, I don't think kids feel like they need to know a lot of things now because they can just look them up right away. They
Mhm.
don't need to know when Charles Dickens was born or what his 5 most famous novels are, because they can just find it out in 15 seconds on Google.
Yeah.
So how is knowledge still going to be important as we move forward?
So the way that I think about that is distinguishing knowledge from information, right? So that data point about when Charles Dickens was born is something that you can look up. Do I need to, is that ever going to change? No, it's probably not going to change. But do I know what else was happening in the world at that moment that might have influenced the way that he was writing, why he was writing the way that he did, why he got paid per page instead of, for a book as a whole, like all of these things, that's where I think knowledge still can influence and be important. I remember I had a chemistry professor who he changed the way that he did tests. He said, if you can look it up in a book, I'm not going to test you on it, because you can go and look it up in a book after this class ends. When you're out actually doing chemistry, what are you going to do? You're going to look it up in a book. But what I am going to test you on is your ability to take the information in the book and apply it to problems. Or I'm going to take it and ask you to connect up ideas in a way that you're not going to be able to look up in the index of that book. And so I think what knowledge then becomes is the ability to connect ideas, to take from sometimes disparate fields, which is something that sometimes I like and sometimes I don't like. Like when people apply quantum physics ideas to sociology, I don't like that. It's a pet peeve. Again, we didn't get a chance to go through introductions. I hope some people here appreciate that. However, there are some ideas which I think what we've seen is that, in the history of science and history of technology and disciplines and things like that, new disciplines get formed at the intersection of old disciplines. And so whether you're taking nanotechnology and applying it to agriculture, whether you're taking telecommunications and applying that to fashion, like this is actually where the future gets written, is starting to mash up or mix up these different skill sets and different knowledges and different industries. That's not something you're going to be able to look up in a book, because that book hasn't been written yet. And so I think it's a great question, but for me, it's a lot about making those connections in order to produce new knowledge, as opposed to just regurgitating information and data that already exists.
I'm going to give you an A in that answer.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Tremendous. I'm just, Jed, I hope you don't mind if I'm going to call on you, Jed. We have a philosopher in the group, and I'm just wondering what you think about all this, Jed. I think you you unmuted yourself at one point, but then you might not have had a chance to ask a question. Whoops, and you're muted right now. Can I unmute him?
Jed, you're on mute, just so you know.
Need to unmute yourself, Jed.
Thank you very much. I'm
there
just
you go.
saying, it's late in the day, and I actually am supposed to be meeting some people at 5 o'clock, so I'm gonna ask the questions I really don't want an answer, or I do, but I don't want to know. I don't know what I want. So when I think fakes, I think bad, but yet your implication was that you can have these what I want to say, the communication programs that take statistics and report them out very well. And what's it matter if I'm hearing it from a live person or a computer program, if I'm getting the right information that's actually accurate? Right. You mentioned the same thing with the persons does not exist. If I don't want to upset anybody's rights, then I can put that photo online, even though I think then the person I see, the person who's looking at, thinks this is a real person. So I don't know where the ethical issue there is about deception or not. And then the other question I did have, and I'm sorry, Paul, you said that we're training the machines that are creating these autonomous systems. So there's two questions there. Autonomous systems, things can happen without us having to make a decision. That concerns me. Then there's the deep AI question. When do autonomous systems take on ethical status? That's in there. And then you said we are training the machines, but then my concern is that true, or are the machines training us? So those are the big questions I was going to get into.
I think both is the answer to your last question. We have adapted our behaviors to machines, certainly without a doubt. And yet we are also training the machines in many cases. I think your point about things happening without us making the decision is interesting, because if I tell you that I can save you $150 a month on your electric bill by having your Nest thermostat turn down your house when you're not there, and it learns when you're there and not, you start to say that's going to pay for itself in a couple of months. I like that. So I think it's about the scope and the scale of what are the decisions that we're allowing these machines to make without oversight, and what are the ones that we're allowing them to make that might require oversight. What are the ones that we don't want them to make too? I don't want anybody having access to the red button on the president's desk to launch the nukes. Like, I saw war games. That's plausible to me. I don't want that happening. And so this is where I think people like you in your field are going to open up new job descriptions, because who's going to train the AI? So AI ethicist might not be a job that exists now, but it's one that should exist. I think we've seen some of that coming out of Google. There are issues associated with that that have kind of come out in the news, but those are the types of new jobs that are going to come about because people are asking those questions.
All right, well, thank you all very much. I think we could go for a very long time on this topic. And Jeffrey, we might ask you to come back
I'd love to.
in the next year of the grant, because I think you've raised so many issues that have a lot of potential for follow-up in all sorts of areas. I'm actually very interested in esports myself. I'm not playing them, but the idea of them. Anyway, thank you so much, everybody. And thank you, Jeffrey. And we shall see you all next week.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was great.
Thanks. And Paul, if you want me to come talk on esports, I'm happy to.
Yeah, hang on for a
Thank you.
second, Jeffrey.
Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you so much. That's, I think you ticked all the boxes. I really like how you focused on, you know, what the grant is, our grant is about, digital literacy, but you also got into the really kind of fun, deep questions with the deep fakes and truth decay and all that stuff. So I'm feel validated in asking you to speak
Okay,
to us after seeing you at EDUCAUSE. I am truly serious. I'm not flattering you. I really think we're going to want to have you back. I think what I would do is talk to faculty and see which of these many topics they might want to pick your brain on
Okay.
some more. So, you know, I'll be in touch about that. But again, just thank you so much. And if you ever need somebody to tell your boss what a wonderful job you're doing, I will give you
I
a
appreciate that.
testimonial. So, and
All
I
right.
thought it was great too. You connected right away. We had, I think there were three chemists
Oh, good. Good.
in the group. So, and not to mention 3 librarians. So, you know, you started very well and kept going nicely. So
Fantastic.
anyway, thank you so much. And I will be in touch.
Sounds good. All right. Thanks, Paul. Have a great
Thanks.
weekend.
You too.